Okay, I'm running it here.
Without destroying the safety net for people.
Well, it should be.
I know exactly.
Yeah, it is.
It's already here, that wouldn't be.
All right.
Oh, it comes out as full force.
We are continuing to work our way through the profile index, and we're going very, very slowly because we're looking at a lot of psychology and we're looking at a lot of mysticism at the same time. Last time we looked a lot at the life and works of Sigmund Freud relatives to types and typology. And in that last meeting, we mentioned that Freud never developed a psychological typology. Some people might ask relative to that, then what is what Freud called an oral sadistic type, or an anal masochistic type, or something of that nature? Aren't they part of a typology? And the answer to that is a qualified yes. In psychoanalysis, as developed by Freud, there are psychologies that are typed, but they are all a result of blocked or deviate or inhibited development. He wouldn't use those words, not all of them, but there are different degrees of being stuck in coming to maturation. So there's some kind of arrestment of character development. So different people get stuck at different stages, you might say. Freud even did a lot with the 7-year periods, the climacterices, and that came along. Looking at it like Freud would look at it, you would say that they represented types of imperfect development. Something like a tree that is bent or is malformed because a twig was bent when it was small, or if a tree doesn't get light, it takes a strange shape from what it would be if it did have full light. Then most people would ask, if that's the case, what is perfect development? Or what is the ideal psychological maturation for a human being? And Freud does not have a positive answer to that. To him, there is no perfect. There is no ideal. To him, everyone, including Freud himself, has some kind of problems, some kinds of imperfections, major or minor, and some of them are more permanent and some are more transitory. Now we remember that he was an atheist materialist and very strong about Darwinian type evolution. And he sees evolution as a process where some things don't adapt and they get discarded, and so that there are imperfections in everything. And this is the way he saw this happening in human beings. The idea that there would be a sin or that there would be some kind of moral or spiritual standard or something like that to aim ourselves at, to try to come to, that wasn't even in his consciousness. It's interesting that despite having this view about nature being so imperfect, he loved nature, and he went hiking every year in the mountains because he loved the beauty of it all. So it's interesting how he could have both views at the same time. I guess it's like all human beings that we have a lot of contradictions in us, but it's when we are in the spotlight of human thought, or people are looking at us to see whether our philosophy is qualified or not, we notice them more. Freud was primarily a psychotherapist, and his mission was to clear up suffering. And he was pretty successful in that. He was able to help a lot of people. But he was always looking at people who were not healthy. He did not practice psychoanalysis on people in his everyday life unless something came up that was important to do so. But for the most part, he just, didn't look at it. So his outlook, if we think about it, is basically negative. But if we look at his horoscope, he has the sun, the moon, and the ascendant all in what we call negative signs. And he is more likely to be looking at things from a darker point of view. Now we're going to turn to Carl Jung, and we're going to look at his outlook on life and his typology. And when we do something like that, we see a very different outlook. Jung was also a psychotherapist, and he wanted to relieve human suffering. But he was much more interested in wanting to participate in larger philosophical matters. You might say that Freud tried to figure out what went wrong in order to produce a given condition, and that Jung did that also. But Jung would ask a question more like, what was there to go wrong? When Jung got into psychotherapy, even before he met Freud, he started working with patients, and they had all kinds of crazy talk. If you go out to Mendota Mental Institute and talk to people there, you'll find there is indeed a lot of crazy talk. But Jung wanted to know what that meant. Freud did too, but Jung asked further questions like, what is the psyche made? Now, Freud did have a concept of ego and id and superego, but they were not so much in terms of flavors of inner experience, and they were mostly structural. Now, because Jung looked at healthy people as much as unhealthy people, and because he asked the philosophical questions he asked, he founded a rather elaborate typology. The psychological typology of Carl Gustav Jung is, compared to all other psychologists, it's way broader, and it has many, many more insights than anyone else. Now, that typology of Carl Jung is not as extensive, and it is not as elaborate as astrology. But it was sufficient to be quite accurate and quite explanatory of psychological conditions, as well as what you might call a meta-psychology, which would be an overall psychological outlook at life itself. Now, in the typology of Jung, he saw types based on accentuations of character determinants. I don't know how to say it any other way, of the functions of the natural psyche, the natural soul. He thought that there were certain determinants. And by emphasizing or de-emphasizing them. One was developed to become one type or another. So his development or his typology was not just a matter of misdevelopment, but it was something more like mixing paints. If you're a painter and you mix paints and you see the different tones or qualities and feelings that you get by mixing this color with that color, something like that is the way he thought character developed. And that we all had within us basic paints, and that for some reason or another we accentuated one kind of color rather than another. Now, the way he describes characters in terms of the functions or the determinant elements of character is marvelous. He has really, really beautiful things to say, and his observations about what it means in human behavior and why it means that in human behavior, that's wonderful. You see a character type study of Jung's, and it's like looking at a landscape. You see like a whole panorama of the colors of character. In all of this, the descriptions of character and of behavior and its meaning, when we look at them, they're different from when we look at the descriptions of character that come from astrologers. And this is important. And this is the beginning of tonight's sermon. The work of successful psychotherapists like Freud and Jung is based on observation. Both Freud and Jung thought that there was no such thing as a meaningless psychological fact. If I point to any one of you and ask you to say something that has no meaning, you get almost dumbfounded because you can't say something without meaning. And if you just try to throw something out randomly, somebody like Freud or Jung, by asking you a few questions that were associated with it, you could see that it was not random. Like Freud was a strict determinist, Jung pretty much was not that kind of a determinist, but realized that there was nothing meaningless that took place in the soul, that everything had some meaning to the individual. Now, the observations of psychotherapists are long and deep and careful. Neither of these people shot from the hip. Even if they had intuitions, they let the observations come and prove themselves first. So eventually, out of all their observations and the conclusions that they came to from given cases, they did develop theories. Freud's theories of the nature of the psyche and how it develops or misdevelops were much more careful than those of Jung. Jung is sort of does a lot of broad speculation on things. Astrology and the way astrologers work is different. Astrology is almost like religion. One learns the basics of astrology and intuits and deduces from those basic tenets, which is why quite a few astrology books from generation to generation to generation do not change, because they all started with the same tenets and they all deduced from those things, and it didn't evolve. I'd say in maybe the last 100 years it has changed a little bit, but not much. Success in astrology is based on the quality of your intuition and the ability to interpret your own intuition. It is not so much based on observation. So if you look at the methods of psychotherapists, it is an outside-in phenomenon. They draw facts from the external world and take them in until they have intuitions, and then they check those intuitions as you do with anything scientific to see whether they're true. What happens with most astrologers is they're presented with a horoscope and they have intuitions and they expostulate on those intuitions. Now that's more of an inside-out approach, and it's more deductive. It's definitely more mystical. Both approaches have something that is valuable, and both are incomplete. To be whole people, we have to be able to do both. We have to get facts from the limitations of the external worlds and take them into our consciousness, and we have to be able to take our intuitive insight and carry it through to check it out in the external worlds. In order to be helpful to people, we want to help them to be whole. And we can't help them to be whole unless we ourselves are whole. So it is incumbent on us to be people who are as much outside in people as we are inside out people. Both views can benefit from each other. I think that it would be really valuable if astrologers did much, much more observation. But it's tough because they don't have the advantage that the psychotherapists have. Psychotherapists have many meetings, sometimes over a course of several years, and they have plenty of time to make a lot of observations. Whereas with an astrologer, you sometimes only see a person once, and they're expecting you to expound immediately, and you're supposed to tell them what they are rather than discover the person together. Even the astrologers, and there are quite a few of them that consider themselves atheists, are basically almost like religious people, because the way they speak about their deductions or their intuitions or their hunches that they have on a horoscope sounds very much like a religious experience. So what we want to do is follow the admonition of Roger Bacon. Roger Bacon was an alchemist and decidedly mystical person, so mystical that the last years of his life he cemented himself into a cell. And he spent all of his time in that cell praying. Food would come in, there was a little opening in the bottom, and food would come in and excrement would go out. But he spent all of his time in there praying. The conclusion he came to, he says, we must not be like ants who just move things around outside of us, nor must we be like spiders who spin everything out from inside of us. We must be like bees who take something from without and mix it with something from within to make something that is sweet to the glory of God. Sermon over. Now this brings us directly into the typology of Carl Jung. The most basic division in Jungian typology is binary. There are two types, and the character type is determined by the psychological relationship of the subject to the object. Many people don't see it that way. They don't understand it that way. They try to look at the character type, but they don't understand that it's based on the relationship to an object. We're going to have a lot to say about it. One of the two character types is an extrovert. Someone who places the emphasis on the object, while an introvert is someone who places the emphasis on the subject in the subject-object relationship. Again, Jung is extremely wise in saying it is healthy to not be a type. Because if you are a type, you are fixed. So it's much better to think in terms of extroversion and introversion rather than someone being an extrovert or an introvert, which is a fixed type. And in all things, balance and flexibility are healthy. We know that from studying a lot of horoscopes, that the more balanced someone is, the more likely they are to be healthy. So let's take an example. Cheesecake. An extrovert is more likely to find the cheesecake attractive, though both will enjoy it. But in the enjoyment, the extrovert will believe that the value, the flavor, the taste of the cheesecake in the experience of subject and object is in the cheesecake. Whereas the introvert in that relationship is more likely to think that the value is in the person eating it. Because if a person has not cultivated the ability to appreciate it, no matter how good the cheesecake outside is, it won't be a rich experience. So I can't think of the cheesecake being anything but a rich experience. So we're using words like more likely, that the extrovert is more likely to find the value in the cheesecake and the introvert is more likely to find it in the self. Now, if a person is extremely introversive or extroversive, the understressed member of the introversive or extroversive force takes on near pathological characteristics. And you can tell if someone is an extreme introvert, they are afraid of the external world. And if someone is an extreme extrovert, they're afraid of the inner world. So the rejected member or the downplayed member becomes fearsome. That's always what happens with things that we neglect. When we neglect them, they seem to become insurmountable to us. The extreme introverted individual is likely to believe that external things have power over them. Like there are totem objects outside of us that have power over us. An introvert might lie in bed and say, that piece of cheesecake in the refrigerator is calling me. And when it calls me and I eat it up, it's going to interfere with my clear inner consciousness. Extroverts, on the other hand, are suspicious of inner thoughts and emotions because they're not as reliable as things outside. And this is the case even if they're good thinkers. Extrovert might say something like, I'm going to enjoy this delicious piece of cheesecake and think about the consequences of it later when I'm going to sleep. And I've tired myself out from indulging in the external world. That's the way it goes. Even if we're uncomfortable with what we neglect, and we may be anxious about it, we consciously or unconsciously attract ourselves to the opposite because we need it. And it often happens, and if you look at all the married couples you see around you, can't say all of them, but it frequently happens that extroversive people form partnerships with introversive people. They even feel more safe when they're around the opposite, because the opposite is what they aren't. It's almost like saying, you do the thinking and I'll do the doing, and I'll know that your thoughts will help me out, kind of a thing. I have one friend who is psychologically observant and has read a lot of Jung, and she's pretty introversive, and her partner's extroverted. She once cringingly confided to me this saying that, you know, he actually wakes up in the morning whistling and ready to take on the external world. She didn't, that blew her away. And then on another occasion, she confessed to me, she said that sometimes he says to me things like, you probably know every thought you think. I'm sure that all of you have seen these sort of things. Doers sometimes feel edgy about thinkers and feelers, but they know that they need them. Now, whole societies or whole disciplines are more introversive or extroversive. Now, some people think the Irish are introversive and that the English with their empiricists are extroversive. Science is obviously extremely extroverted because they believe that the truth is in the external facts. Mathematicians, on the other hand, are extremely introverted in that they know that the truth is within, and unless you make those connections within, you're not getting at the truth. You know that a lot of mathematicians now, when put on the questioning, if you put them in, a lot of them say that they're Neoplatonists, and that's completely internalized. The further we go back in history, in general, conditions are more introverted. And the further we go toward the future, the more things are extroverted. But even in that, there are fluctuations. Like the Greeks were very introverted, and the Romans were obviously very extroverted. Modern American culture is very extroversive. Now, when Carl Jung was first developing his typology, he thought that feeling was extroversive because it led to motivation. And he thought that thinking was introversive because you had to turn inward to think. Eventually, he came to the conclusion that you could be an introverted and an extroverted thinker, that everything applied to every other case. Hermann Hesse was a friend and an early patient of Carl Jung, and he wrote a book, very beautiful book, called Narcissus and Goldman. And this is when Jung had the earlier view that was yet undeveloped. And Narcissus is supposed to be the image of an introverted thinker, and Goldman is meant to be an extroverted feeler. The character studies are lovely. The rest of the book is, neither here nor there. I don't even remember the plot or anything like that. But the character development is lovely. In fact, there's something that was in that I've never seen anywhere else, and I've never encountered. I've read a lot of mysticism and a lot of fiction and a lot of psychology, but Goldman makes a statement in that book that only I've seen there. And he said that after I've had an outward experience, I feel hollowed out and empty, almost like I could crumple inward. And that's exactly that's the way I'll feel tonight after this is all over and I've given out as much as I can give out. That's the way I will feel. Now, this is a course that is called Astrology, Psychology, and Mysticism. And it's about all three as different facets of getting to understand humans. Now, if you're interested in the mysticism of introversion and extroversion, we're not going to do it in this class. But if you come next week in the spiritual philosophy class, we'll be covering that as part of a cosmological process, introversion and extroversion. And so if you want to get the missing manual, as they say, and technical things, next week we'll be talking about that. Though it won't sound anything like this talk at all. It's very serendipitous that the two courses converge at this point or are in agreement at this point, so I don't have to repeat myself. All right. When we look at the astrology relative to introversion and extroversion, we encounter complications. First off, we have to determine whether it is true. After having read Jung's typology several times and looked at it in the world and have come to my own conclusions, I've satisfied in myself that there is indeed introversion and extroversion in a psychological sense of them, and that the statements that he makes are generally true. He makes a few clunkers in there, but not many. Now, astrologically, when we're looking at the profile index, as we are doing now, it's tempting to say that introversion and extroversion are associated with the polarities, the positive signs and the negative signs. That is to say that the positive signs are extroverted and that the negative signs are introverted. But that's not what was meant as when astrology was formed. The positive and negative signs are an integral part of number 4 on the index, which is the element of it's part of the 4-element system. And that system goes back to a different time in history when everything was termed natural philosophy. And in natural philosophy, what occurred in nature, human beings were just an extension of it. And so that if we had astrological elements like fire, air, water, and earth, that those were the same as we saw in nature, only expressed more in humans. That was before there was a separate study of psychology. It was all part of one natural history or natural philosophy. It was a system of active and passive elements, or a system of more or less active forces, or resistance to active forces. The system works something like this. Fire stirs air. The sun causes convection in the atmosphere. Or if you light a fire, it heats the air and it rises and air comes rushing into your fire. Mind you, all of these things we're talking about in nature, but they actually have something in our character, according to that ancient astrological doctrine. And if you look at human character in the same way that you can use Jung's typology, you can also use this and come to understandings. Thus, the air, when the air comes rushing in, it feeds the fire. And so there's something like a synergy between fire and air. Air is not just the passive element receiving its drive from the fire. It has its own activity. Look at wave action. That's all due to air. And air works on water in another way. In its dryness, it absorbs water and it uplifts it. So we can see that relative to water, air is a more active element. And its uplifting is very different than the current uplifting that comes from heat. Fire moves water also, and it moves water also beyond the upliftment with the air, because boiling is an example of water being moved by fire, or ocean currents like the Humboldt current or the Gulf Stream or something like that. Those are all result of fire acting on water. So fire acts on both air and water. Water works on air works on water. On the other hand, water can move earth. We see this all the time. It erodes earth, and in the form of silt, it distributes it through the oceans. The extreme of water moving earth is like a tsunami. Water also moves earth by upliftment in its own way. If you take something and put it in water, water will dissolve it and take it into itself in the absorption process. Fire can move earth also. We see this happen all the time in volcanism. And air can move earth also, and we see that in sandstorms. So we see from this that in the elements there is a hierarchy of activity. Or in inverse, it's a hierarchy of passivity. Fire is the most active and the most moving element, and earth is the least. The inverse goes in that earth can be used to dam up water, or it can dam up air in what is called the Santa Ana effect. And it can smother fire. If you're putting out a campfire, if you have a campfire, you smother it with earth. Hopefully there's no peat moss in the earth, but that's the way it goes. Water stagnates air and eventually weighs it down so that we have the heavy atmosphere of a storm. Air inhibits fire as much as it feeds it. If it weren't for the airy atmosphere, all life on Earth would be burned up, so that the air has its own impedition. So we can see that through the four elements there's a scale of resistance to change and a scale of activity, one being the inverse of the other. The higher two elements are more active than they are passive or resistant. And the lower two elements are more passive, more resistive, and so they become negative. So that's the way the polarities developed in astrology. The difference in this is even something sensible. We can see earth and we can see water. There's transparency, but we can still see it. But how does the poem go? Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I. But when the trees are bending down, the wind is passing by. And we don't see fire either. The only thing we see are earth particles that have been heated up so that they glow. But the fire itself we never see. Now this is all very fascinating. And this is one of those cases where it is incumbent on astrologers, back to the sermon again, to practice observation. Find out all of the people who are very airy sign people or very earthy sign people and see how the natural elements actually work in their character. Because we just now, in talking about the elements, we've talked about them only as nature things. We haven't seen their function in inner psychology. It's fascinating to watch somebody throw water on someone else's fire in terms of a conversation. It's not relevant to what we're doing now. We'll do a little bit of that when we come to the number 4 test, the 4-element test, which will probably be the next meeting, which will be the last meeting for the semester. But right now it's not relevant. So the question at hand is whether the positive signs are congruent with extroversion and the negative signs are congruent with introversion. As far as I can tell, the answer is yes and no. Horoscopes with a preponderance of positive sign, foci, do seem to give forth more generally. And horoscopes with negative signs do seem to take in a lot more. But I can't say that the positive signs are necessarily extroverts and that the negative signs are necessarily introverts. Humans and human psychology are not that simple. In the first place, Jung's description of an extrovert is not just someone who gives out. Again, he sees the relationship of the subject to the object as being what's important. In an extrovert, the attention is on the object. And in an introvert, the attention is on the subject. And that's not always the case with positive and negative signs. Moreover, somebody might give out a lot and may not like doing so relative to the object. Myself, personally, I'm a good example. I hold forth and I give a lot. I'm always talking, doing too much of it, but I much prefer the preparation for the talks when I'm in solitude, working all alone, much prefer that to the giving out. That's a personal thing. I enjoy both. I believe it's valuable to share, and I try to be as balanced as I can, but I find myself that as time goes on, I'm becoming progressively more introversive. So you could say I do have a balance between positive and negative signs, but again, it's not the same thing as introversion versus extroversion according to Carl Jung. The reason I can say that is because there is a test called the Myers-Briggs test. And the Myers-Briggs test is something that you take, and there are many, many questions in it, and it tells you whether you are more introvert or extrovert, whether you are more of a thinker, more of an intuitor, more of a feeler, or more of a sensor. And then there are primary and secondary characteristics or functions in yourself. And I've taken that test. I have a friend that was a certified person for giving the test, and it comes out that I am definitely introversive. Mysticism, by definition, is introversive, just as science is by definition extroversive. The outer truth is the all to the scientist, whereas the inner truth is the all to the mystic. But strangely, they both need each other. Jung considered himself a scientist, and he also considered himself an introvert. If we look at his horoscope, everybody should have it out. He has 5 positive sign planets and 5 negative sign planets, which is pretty balanced, except that the primary angles, the ascendant and the midheaven, are both positive. A person doesn't have to be an extrovert to be a scientist, because the 2 categories, scientist and extroversion, are independent categories. One could say that Jung treated mystical subjects scientifically, but that's a good start, but that's not all of it. If we look at this and we start comparing things and asking questions, we can see that this is not a simple thing. People just cannot be sized up or typed or maneuvered easily. Character is much more fluent, and it's much more subtle, and it's much more flexible than that. Now, fortunately, as we're going to see the next time we meet, that Jung had other elements in his typology that give a much better picture. Again, astrology, thank goodness, has even more elements, and in that it is superior to any psychological typology if we apply it skillfully and if we know what we're doing. And let's do a little bit of my notes are all twisted around one way or another. Astrology is very elaborate, and it's very fruitful in terms of human understanding. But in that, it demands a lot of us as practitioners. It would be relatively simple if we could determine introversion and extroversion by the astrological polarities. But the reality is not that simple. There are other functions and there are other determinants of psychological stances. Each gives additional information, and each gives a better understanding for how and why it exists and what it means. Let's take an example of what I'm trying to say, that you have to look for all kinds of curves. Suppose a person has a great preponderance of positive planets, positive sign planets over negative sign planets. But suppose most of the planets are in the 4th, the 8th, and the 12th houses. Even though there's all that positive sign influence, the person is likely to still be an introvert. But since the introversion comes from the houses and not the signs, it's likely an introversion developed by circumstance. It's like a circumstantial driven introversion. There are diurnal and nocturnal planets. And if a person has an outstandingly strong nocturnal planet, no matter how many planets are in positive signs, that could be the symbol of an introvert or introversion. It might be because that strong person, suppose this is something like a strong Saturn, which is definitely probably the most nocturnal planet. And that means that it would be a person in your life always saying no to everything you wanted to do. And that means that that planet would drive you inward. And that would be a kind of introversion. It could even be a physical introversion. Suppose you have a bad stomach. If you have a bad stomach, you're going to be introverted because you're going to be thinking about your stomach a lot. And so you can see that it's not really simple. And what I'm trying to say is, if we look at things psychologically, if we look at things astrologically, we have to take a lot of things into account. And we have to be willing to do some observing and studying and testing to see where we're at. All right, for just a few minutes, we'll come back to it in application. Let's look at number 3 on the profile index. It's called the attribute test and profiles. The attributes are determined by dividing the signs into 3, so that there are 3 different types of signs. It's a symmetric division, but it is not all in one spot, but every third sign belongs to a type. So we start with Aries, that's a cardinal. Taurus is fixed. Gemini is common. And then we go back to another cardinal sign. So we can see there are 4 cardinal signs, 4 fixed signs, and 4 mutable signs.
Is common and mutable the same?
Yes, common and mutable are the same. Now we go... We're not going to say much about the attributes at this time. Next time, or beginning next semester, will be a handout with all sorts of things in it about them. This is just a little exegesis in trying to understand Freud and especially Jung with regard to their psychologies. Neither Freud nor Jung had anything tripartite in their typologies. As said before, Jung did not have a philosophical disposition, and he didn't think that way in terms of a system. It's not that he didn't know anything about philosophy. He was extremely well read in ancient philosophy up to the philosophy of his times. But for him, it was more a matter of his not wanting to infer anything that didn't come directly from science. He didn't want to distract from scientific investigation at all. At various times in his life, he was a physical scientist. He was a neurologist, and a very famed neurologist before he became a psychotherapist. And he would not allow any of his followers to incorporate philosophical theories into psychoanalysis, even though they seemed to fit. One of his closest followers wanted to mix psychoanalysis with Hegelian philosophy, because Hegel was still very big in Europe at that time. And he said, no, you can't do that, or you're out of our group altogether. So he was a scientist in that he treated psychoanalysis as a science and used scientific reasoning, scientific testing, and at most used hypotheses, but they had to be tested out. Now with Carl Jung, it's a very different matter. Carl Jung also claimed to be a scientist and speak as a scientist, though he was much softer in that. He was also a physician, just like Freud was, and he was educated in the science, all the sciences, but he was never really an active material scientist. he was not nearly as scientifically rigorous as Freud. His rigor was more in scholarship. Now, he was somewhat mystical. His ancestors on his mother's side, including his mother, were involuntary clairvoyants. He himself had involuntary clairvoyant experiences, but they were more in terms of symbols rather than direct perceptions. We're going to come all back to all this much more later on. He actually led and participated in seances. And he read much more of occultism than he let on. And I'm not just talking about alchemy, I'm talking about all the occultism of his time. But he wouldn't let on that he did it because he wanted his work to be considered a science. In fact, it looks like a lot of his psychology is lifted straight out of occultism. And Freud used to scold him for saying that he was drifting into occultism. Now, he seems a little bit divided and confused about philosophy and theology. It'll come up at another time, but I couldn't believe one of his books. He makes bold statements, both philosophically and religiously, but then he says, I'm not talking about philosophy or religion, I'm talking about psychology, as the psychology applies to them. And in some cases, he's true. In some cases, he isn't. It's a difficult thing. And the number 3 is one of those cases. We're talking about that number 3 on the chart up here. He went to great extremes to say that the number 3 was an incomplete number, and that the number 3 begged number 4 to become complete. And he was adamant and vociferous about it. One of the commentators on his philosophy said, when it comes down to it, Jung never really had a God. But if he had had a God, it would have been the number 4. You wonder about these things when they come up in a person. Jung points to the number 4 in psychological and religious mandalas, and says that when a person develops a certain degree of spirituality, they start making mandalas and they're loaded with squares. But at the same time, he neglects that there are mandalas, and especially yantras, that are loaded with triangles. And he won't mention he won't mention that. And it's really hard. He was an extremely erudite scholar. I can't believe how much he read. And the thing is, he was a tendentious scholar. He would quote, for example, an alchemist on the importance of the number 4, while that same alchemist had much more to say about the importance of the number 3 over the number 4, but Jung doesn't mention that. He makes a quote from that person about the number 4. He quotes authors who agree with his view, even though those aren't the most important statements that those authors made, and that they made many others that don't agree with what Jung said. So there's a little bit of tendentiousness in there. I would say anything by Carl Jung is a great read. You want to read it because it's going to open up whole corridors of thought for you. It's going to cause you to ask questions and it's going to cause you to investigate things. But just be careful when you do. It's a speculation on my part that the reason that he didn't like the number 3 is because he knew, going all the way back to the Neoplatonists, that the number 3 was the number of spiritual completeness. And he did not want to be associated with spiritual completeness. He wanted this to be a science. So 4 is the number of science. At any rate, neither Freud nor Jung has anything like the number 3, like the attribute test and profiles in their works. Now, in this series of talks, we're actually going to delve into and go into the attributes and apply them. And we're going to apply them to the horoscopes of Freud and Jung. But that's all in the future. This is as far as we're going tonight. And the next time we meet, we're going to continue on with the study of Carl Jung's typology, which is a very beautiful thing. I'm going to look around and see if I can get another cheap copy of the Psychology of Types so that I can pass it around so that everybody gets a chance to read it. It's a magnificent, magnificent book. I found only one statement in it that I didn't like at all, and that was referring to people like us, who he referred to as theosophists. And he said, this kind of person is a theosophist. And as a theosophist, they're the type of people who have too many answers. Not whether those answers are true or false, but whether they have too many or not. But at any rate, you can't, the book is really, really worthwhile reading. And if you want to understand people, you want to start making observations of people, it's really good. And next week, if you want to go into introversion and extroversion as part of cosmological process, even if you're only interested in the astrology, it'll be a worthwhile talk in that regard. Next meeting that we meet in this class will be the 17th, and that'll be the last one for the semester. And by then I will have a schedule made out for next semester. Any questions? Yes?
I was wondering what Jung did with like the idea of the Trinity, like 3 and the Trinity, and his relationship to Christianity and all that stuff.
He studied those things and he talks about them, but he doesn't talk about them as being psychologically significant to psychology. Yeah, but he really doesn't understand the Trinity of Christianity. I'll just mention it off to the side. He has a book called Answer to Job. And I couldn't believe some of the things he said in there. It's just he doesn't know the most rudimentary things about Christianity, even though his father was a minister. And I would be dumbstruck, and I would say to myself, it can't get any worse than this. And then about 10 or 20 pages later, the same thing happened. It happened 4 times while reading through that book that I said to myself, it can't get any worse than this.
Ministers' kids are the worst. I am one, sorry.
No, I've had very good interactions basically with ministers.
No, I'm just kidding.
I'm immune because they think I'm crazy. So, thank you very much.
Wait, thank you, Richard. You have a question here too.
Yes.
Are you familiar with socionics?
What?
Are you familiar with socionics?
What is the name again?
Socionics.
Socionics?
Yeah, it's another base 16 personality system. That
Oh,
really
okay.
It's also based on the typology of Jung, although it explores it in much greater detail. It applies
Okay.
a lot of other concepts from other fields like abstract systems theory. And most importantly, I think it provides a working model of the psyche, not just something where time doesn't exist, where there's not information actually flowing through the connections.
I'll look into it. In fact, we looked into Gestaltism, and I might even look into Ennead typology if we have enough time in the class for psychological understanding.
That'd be interesting.
Good. Thank you very much.